We're going to get stuck into the 2018 question. So it was D Fahy. So this was a 100-marker question, question 7. So the trial balance of D Fahy, garage owner, failed to agree on the 31st of the 12th, 2017. The difference was entered in a suspense account and the following balance sheet was prepared. So the trial balance failed to agree, so the debit side did not equal the credit side. So what Fahy's bookkeeper did at that point in time was then they just took whatever the difference was on the debit or credit side, okay, and slotted it in. And in this case, they slotted the difference in with the creditor's figure so that the debit side and the credit side would equal, and therefore we would balance the balance sheet here. All right. So there was a few mistakes, and the mistakes were thrown in with the creditors there. So on checking the books, the following errors and omissions were discovered. So number 1, a car lift purchased on credit for 4,000 had been entered on the incorrect side of the creditor's account. The only other entry made was a debit of 400 to the purchase account. Number 2, D Fahy's private car valued at €10,000 was presented to the business for resale. No entry was made in the books regarding this transaction. This car was later sold on credit to a debtor of the business for €10,000. The sale had been treated as a cash sale. Number 3, D Fahy had returned a motor car previously purchased on credit from a supplier for €12,000 and entered this transaction in the relevant ledger accounts incorrectly as 1,200. However, a credit note subsequently arrived from a supplier showing a restocking charge of €200 to cover the cost of the return. The only entry made in respect to this credit note was a credit entry of 11,800 in the creditor's account. Number 4, a payment of €500 was received from F. McFadden, a debtor whose debt had previously been written off and who wishes to trade with D Fahy again. This represents 80% of the original debt, and the debtor has undertaken to pay the remainder of the debt by January 2018. No entry had been made in the books. Number 5, D Fahy purchased goods on credit from Car Parts Limited for €3,000 plus VAT at 13.5%. The only entries in the accounts were that the VAT inclusive figure was entered on the debit side of the equipment account and the VAT exclusive figure entered on the credit side of Car Parts Limited account. Okay, so there's all your errors there, and what we're asked to do is, do a few things next. But first of all, we'll take note that D Fahy is a garage owner, and that will be important to us when we're looking at making our corrections there. So you're asked to do part A, journalise the necessary corrections. You can see 54 marks going there. Part B, show the suspense account for 6 marks. C, prepare a statement showing the correct net profit for 14 marks. D, prepare a corrected balance sheet for 20 marks. And E, outline the purpose of a suspense account. So your theory there, 6 marks. So all in all, 100 marks there. Okay, so let's get started with part A, which is 54 marks. So that is the majority of your marks there. So 13.5% here of your entire exam went for this part A. Okay, so we're looking at our 1 to 5 here to do our part A. And what I want you to do is practice on the question, underlining what should have happened in green and then what happened by mistake in red. So we'll look at them individually as we go on to each one. Okay, so part 1, a car lift purchased on credit for €4,000. Well, that happened, so that is what I should be recording. But it had been entered on the incorrect side of the creditor's account. That happened by mistake, so I underline that red. The only other entry made was a debit of 400 to the purchase account. So that is completely wrong as well, because it's the wrong type of account, all right, and it's also the wrong figure. So we know that that's a mistake as well, so that is also underlined red. So what should have happened? These are just our workings here. So what should have happened? A car lift purchased on credit for €4,000. So a car lift for D Fahy. D Fahy is a garage owner. So a car lift would be equipment. So equipment is an asset account. And so we debit the asset account when our equipment increases. When we purchase something on credit, it is the creditor. So we credit the creditor. The creditor is a liability. So liabilities are always credited when they increase. So that is how your accounts should look. So asset account equipment increased, so therefore debit. Liability account creditor increase, therefore credit. So your alert diagram is going to help you with this. Had been entered on the incorrect side of the creditor's account, so therefore it, by mistake, it was put on the creditor was put on the debit side of the creditor's account. And then the only other entry made was a debit of 400 in the purchase account. So that is what your mistake looked like. So they debited the purchase account by 400 and they put the 4,000 on the incorrect side of the creditor account. So how will we fix this? So first of all, we'll enter the equipment, okay, as it should have been. So debit equipment 4,000, and we will fix our creditors account. So creditor, this is what we want on this side. We want 4,000 on the credit side, but what we have is 4,000 on the debit side. So what we're going to do is put 8,000 on the credit side to fix that. Now, so that's our equipment and creditors fixed, so we've dealt with this as well, but now we have to fix the purchases. So the purchases was entered incorrectly on the debit side, 400, so to fix that, we're going to credit it 400 on the credit side, so that cancels out this entry here. Now, as you know in accounting, all right, in double entry bookkeeping, your debits must always equal your credits. So at this moment in time, you have 8,400 on the credit side and you have 4,000 on the debit side. So we have to enter 4,400 euro on the debit side of the suspense account. So that is part one. And when it asks us to journalize the necessary corrections, this is what we're going to do here. So you're going to lay out your page and a debit column and a credit column, and we'll just list out the figures from this part here. How do we fix it? All right, so you've got your equipment debit side 4,000 here, you've got creditors 8,000 on the credit side, you've got 400 purchases on the credit side, and you have suspense 4,400 on the debit side. Now, after you've corrected each one, you're going to have to put a little narration. So the narrations are worth 1 mark each, so multiply that by 5 hours, you've got 5 marks each here. Now what the examiners want you to say is mention something from the question. All right, now if you know your theory well, you don't have to say, oh, error of omission or error of principle or error of reversal of entries or anything like that. They just want you to mention something about the error. Okay, so being the correction of purchase of a car left on credit being treated incorrectly. So that's all you did there. Okay, so part two. So D. Fahy's private car valued at 10,000 euro was presented to the business for resale. Okay, so that happened, so we're underlining that green. No entry was made in the books regarding this transaction, so that was a mistake, so we underline that red. This car was later sold on credit to a debtor of the business for 10,000 euro. That happened, so we're going to underline that green. And then the sale had been treated as a cash sale. That was an error, that was a mistake, so we underline that red. Okay, so let's look at the first sentence there. So D. Fahy's private car. When we see the word private, we automatically think of drawings if a sole trader took something out of the business, or we think of capital if the sole trader put something into the business. In this case, it is capital because he presented it to the business for resale. So he gave the car to the business. So that is capital, 10,000 euro. Capital is a liability, so we credit the capital account. And when it is something that the business sells, so for example, the business is selling motor cars here, so the 10,000 euro is going to be put into the purchases account. So purchases account is going to be debited. So you have credit the capital, 10,000 euro there, and you have debit the purchases, 10,000 euro there. So that is what should have happened there for the first sentence. The second green sentence, this car was later sold on credit to a debtor of the business for 10,000 euro. What that would look like would be sales. We credit the sales because that's a revenue account. And we debit the debtor because the debtor owes us money. We sold them on credit. So debtor is an asset. We debit the asset, 10,000 euro there. So there are your two green sentences there. Okay. Now, For the mistake, no entry was made in the books regarding this transaction, so nothing was entered about this. But then in relation to the sale to the debtor, the sale had been treated as a cash sale. So that went into the books like that. So sales, 10,000 revenue, all right, so credit the revenue account. So that happened, so that was okay. So the sales won't need to be fixed at all. But then we need to fix it, we need to actually enter the capital, the purchases, and the debtor. Okay, so capital 10,000 on the credit side, purchases 10,000 on the debit side, and debtor 10,000 on the debit side. So that is all of this entered. We don't need to touch the sales because that was put in as it was, but we need to fix this cash account now. So the cash, we want to unwind this, so we're going to credit the cash account 10,000 euro there. So that's that fixed. All we have to do now is slot those figures from our workings into our part A, journalise the necessary corrections. So we have capital credit side 10,000 euro. We have purchases debit side 10,000 euro. We have debtors 10,000 euro debit side. And we have cash credit side 10,000 euro. All right. And now we have to write our little narration. So what is our narration going to be? So, being the recording of capital introduced and correction of credit sale treated as a cash sale. So that is the narration there for that second one. So we're just mentioning something about the error. All right. So part 3. D. Fahy had returned a motor car previously purchased on credit from a supplier for 12,000 euro. Okay, that happened. So I'm going to underline that green because that should be recorded. And this was entered this transaction in the relevant ledger accounts incorrectly as 1,200. So that is a mistake. So we underline that red. Okay. Next sentence. However, a credit note subsequently arrived from a supplier showing a restocking charge of 200 euro to cover the cost of the return. So that happened. So we're going to underline that green. The only entry made in respect of the credit note was a credit entry of 11,800 in the creditors account. So that is completely wrong. So the credit note was only 200 euro, all right, and you know, just completely wrong figures there. So we have to underline that red. All right, so let's look at what should have happened. So the first sentence there, D. Fahy had returned a motor car previously purchased on credit from a supplier for 12,000 euro. So when we see on credit, we purchased it. Who did we purchase it from on credit? A creditor. All right. So when we purchase goods on credit, we debit them because that's an expense. But this is purchase returns. Okay. So you can call it purchases or you can call it purchase returns. It doesn't matter. It just matters what side of the account it's on. So 12,000 purchase returns here on the credit side. And the creditor, we credit the creditor when we buy goods on credit from them. So when we return goods to a creditor, we debit them. All right, so that's the first green sentence there. The second green sentence, however, a credit note subsequently arrived from a supplier showing a restocking charge of 200 euro to cover the cost of the return. We are going to debit the purchase account 200 euro and we are going to credit the creditor account 200 euro because we now owe them this 200 euro again. And we're going to say that the restocking charge, it relates to our purchases, so we put it into the purchase account. Okay, so we've got two figures on either side here. So what we want to do is just find out what's the bigger side and what would the balance then be. So overall, you've got 11,800 on the credit side of the purchase account. So that's 12,000 minus 200 is 11,800. And the creditor account, 12,000 minus 200 is 11,800 here. Okay, so what happened by mistake? So the return, 12,000 euro, was entered in the relevant ledger accounts incorrectly as 1,200. So it was entered into the right accounts and on the right sides because it doesn't say that it was entered on the incorrect sides or anything. So into our purchase and creditor account, we're putting the 1,200 instead of the 12,000. Okay, so that was the mistake there. And the only entry made in respect of the credit note was a credit entry of 11,800 in the creditor's account. So creditor, credit entry, 11,800 here. Okay, so overall the balance of those two there, all right, is 10,600 euro. So let's start fixing it now. So what we want in the purchases account is we want 11,800 on the credit side. What we have is 1,200 on the credit side. So we want 11,800. What we have is 1,200. So what am I going to have to do to the purchases account to get it to be 11,800? Well, I'm going to have to add 10,600 to my already 1,200 to get the 11,800. Now, the creditor account, what I want is 11,800 on the debit side. What I have is 10,600 on the credit side, so completely wrong side. So to get rid of this, I would put 10,600 on the debit side, and then I also need to add the 11,800 on the debit side, what I want to have. So altogether, in my creditor account, I need to put 22,400 on the debit side to get 11,800. Okay, so what I've done is I have put 10,600 on the debit side to cancel out that 10,600 on the credit side, and then I enter my 11,800. So when I add those two together, I get 22,400. Now, as you can see, the debit and the credit side do not equal here. All right, so what I have to do is I'm going to have to create a suspense account. So in my T account there, my suspense, I'm going to have to add 11,800 onto the credit side so that I'm going to have 22,400 on both the debit and the credit sides. All right, so that is part 3 done, and now we'll just take those workings and we'll slot them into our journalize the necessary corrections of part A. So let's have a look. So purchases, 10,600 on the credit side, creditor, 22,400 on the debit side, and suspense, 11,800 on the credit side. Now, what would my narration be? So we're just going to mention something about purchase returns and restocking charge being entered incorrectly. So being the correction of purchase returns and restocking charge entered incorrectly in the books, or whatever you want to say, but we've mentioned something about it there, so that is more than okay there. All right, part 4. So a payment of €500 was received from F. McFadden, a debtor, whose debt had previously been written off and who wishes to trade with D. Fahy again. This represents 80% of the original debt, and the debtor has undertaken to pay the remainder of the debt by January 2018. No entry had been made in the books. Okay, so a payment of 500 was received from a debtor. Where would that go? Well, that would go into the bank account. Bank account is an asset account, so debit the bank. So that is the asset increasing. Okay, so this represents 80% of the original debt, and the debtor has undertaken to pay the remainder of the debt. So the bank 500, that there is 80%. So the other 20% of that, the debtor will pay us again, okay? So the debtor is going to increase, because what happened previously was that we reduced the debtor, okay, by the 100% and wrote off the bad debts 100%, but now they're paying us back, so the debtor is going to be increased now by the 20%, and that is €125. Now, as you know, debits and credits must equal, so you must have 625 on the credit side. What might that be? So 625 on the credit side we know it's liabilities or revenues. So hopefully you'll know that the opposite of bad debt written off is bad debt recovered. So bad debt recovered on the credit side, €625 there. So that is what should have been recorded. Now what happened by mistake? What happened by mistake was that no entry was made in the books. So we had nothing in there whatsoever. So how do I fix it? I just enter them straight in as what should have happened over here. So entering them into my accounts, I've got the bank debit side 500, I've got the debtor 125 debit side, and I've got bad debts recovered 625 on the credit side. And what is my narration going to be? Being recording of bad debt recovered and promise of remaining debt from debtor is absolutely fine, okay? Or being recording of bad debt recovered from debtor. Being recording of €500 received from debtor, and promise of remaining debt to be paid, €125, whatever you want to say, as long as you're mentioning something from the question. Okay, so the last one now is part 5. So D. Fahy purchased goods on credit from Car Parts Limited for €3,000 plus VAT, 13.5%. That happened, so I'm underlining that green. The only entries in the accounts were that the VAT inclusive figure was entered on the debit side of the equipment account, so completely wrong account, all right, and it wouldn't be the VAT inclusive figure as well, so 2 mistakes there. And the VAT exclusive figure entered on the credit side of Car Parts Limited account. So in your creditor account, we need to put in the VAT inclusive figure. So that's also wrong there. So D. Fahy purchased goods on credit from Car Parts Limited for $3,000 plus VAT, 13.5%. All right. So purchases, debit side, €3,000. VAT, debit side, €405. All right. Where did I get the €405? It's €3,000 multiplied by 13.5% is €405. I put VAT on the same side as the item that is attached to. So I know that purchases is an expense. I debit expenses. So therefore I'm going to debit the VAT attached to those purchases. Now, as I've already said, what we're going to put into the creditor account is the VAT inclusive amount. So the 3,000 plus VAT, 13.5%. So the VAT inclusive amount is going on the credit side of the creditor. So your debits and credits equal there. So that's what should have happened. Okay, now let's look at what happened by mistake. So the only entries in the accounts was that the VAT inclusive figure was entered on the debit side of the equipment account. So VAT inclusive figure, debit side of the equipment account. And the VAT exclusive figure entered on the credit side of Car Parts Limited account. So that's the VAT exclusive figure there. Okay, so now I'm going to fix it. So I'll put in my purchases and my VAT. They needed to go in, all right, as is. In the creditor, I need 3,405 in the credit side, but what I already have 3,000, so all I need to do is add another 405. So that's that fixed and that's that entered. And in the equipment account, that shouldn't have went in at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to credit the 3,405 in the equipment account. All right, so I'm going to credit that. Now, at this point in time, my debits and credits do not equal. So if you added them up, you would find that they don't equal. You've got 405 more on the credit side. So what you must do is you must create a suspense account and debit the suspense account €405. And that is that one fixed. So now you're just left to put that into your part A, journalise the necessary corrections. So you've got purchase, €3,000 debit side. You've got VAT, €405 debit side. You've got creditor, €405 credit side. You've got equipment, €3,405 credit side. And you've got suspense, debit, €405. Okay, so that is those entered, and you must remember now to do your narration. So, being correction of VAT inclusive figure for purchases entered in equipment and VAT exclusive figure entered in the creditor's account. So that is all of part A complete, and that is your 54 marks achieved there. So your 13.5% of your exam there that year. So moving on now to do part B, shows the suspense account. So you'll see there 6 marks only, so it should only take you like about a minute and a half to do this. Okay, so what I would tell you to do is go back to your part A and look for every time that you see a suspense figure. So suspense here, 4,400. Nothing in part 2. In part 3, you have a suspense, 11,800. Nothing in part 4, but in part 5, you've got suspense, 405 on the debit side. So those 3 figures, we are going to enter them into the suspense account. And you'll see that I have numbered each of them here. So number 1, number 5, and number 3 here. Okay, so we've taken them from number 1, number 3, and number 5. And what I've done here is I've labelled them. I've just mentioned whatever the mistakes were in each of those relevant ones. Okay, so for example, purchases and creditors were the mistake there in part 1, purchase and creditor in part 3, that was your restocking charge and your purchase returns, and then number 5, it was your purchases and your creditors. Okay, so that is what you do there. All right, and what we have to do now, we have to balance this account out. Okay, so which is the biggest side? It's very clear to see there that the biggest side is the credit side. So 11,800 is the bigger side, so credit side. So what we're going to do, enter the largest amount on both sides. So 11,800 goes on both sides. Do both my sides now equal the 11,800? Well, the credit side does, the debit side doesn't. So I'm going to have to enter something into the debit side in order to make all of these figures now equal 11,800. And they now do. So what I put in here, original difference, €6,995. So remember earlier on I told you that the bookkeeper, the trial balance didn't equal. Okay, so she shoved something into one of the accounts in order to make it equal. So the differences there was 6,995. So that was the total of all the mistakes there. So 6,995 is the suspense account. And where did it go earlier on? She threw it into she threw it into the creditors account, all right? And to make this balance sheet balance, okay? So this figure here is not really the proper creditors figure. All right, so let's have a look here. Now, this here should say creditor. All right, so just pretend that that word there says creditor. So sometimes it goes in with the stock, but it's the creditor in this case. So that should say creditor. So what we need to think about is, so my suspense here, 6,995. Okay, 6,995. What would that have done to my creditor's figure? So if my balance brought down was 52,300, which I got from here, the balance brought down there and the balance carried down here. So 52,300 plus 6,995 is equal to 59,295. So think about it, 59,295 minus 6,995 is equal to 52,300. Okay, so that's how that would really look. That there again should say creditor. Okay, so later on, we're going to take this 6,995 away from the creditors when we're doing our corrected balance sheet in part D. All right, so we'll have to remember that. Okay, part C, prepare a statement showing the corrected net profit, and that is for 14 marks. So back again to our part A, and we want to identify items that would go in our trading profit and loss. So do you remember earlier on I said that items that go in the trading profit and loss are expenses and revenues. Okay, so expenses and revenues. So this figure here for net profit in the balance sheet is incorrect. All right, and it's incorrect because all of these trading profit and loss items, okay, are going to affect the net profit figure. All right, so in part 1 we have purchases, 400 on the credit side. Part 2 we have purchases, debit side. Okay, other items here all belong in the balance sheet. Part 3 we have purchases on the credit side, 10,600. This belongs in the balance sheet. Part 4 we have 2 balance sheet entries here, but the third entry, bad debt recovered, 625, credit side, belongs in the trading profit and loss. And then part 5, we have purchases belongs in the trading profit and loss. The VAT, creditor and equipment all go in the balance sheet. Okay, so how am I going to treat these figures? I've identified that these 5 figures go into the trading profit and loss, but what am I going to do with them now? So remember, it's our expenses and revenues that relate to the trading profit and loss. Okay, now, knowing our alert diagram, we knew that when an expense occurred, we debit it, okay? So any items on the debit side are expenses or they are revenues that have been unwound, okay? So any TPL items on the debit side are going to reduce the net profit figure, all right? Here on our alert diagram, we see revenue here on the credit side. So when a revenue occurs, we credit it. So therefore, items on the credit side, revenues, all right? Or it is an expense being unwound, all right? So it's an expense going down, all right? So either way, whatever they are, anything on the TPL belong to the TPL on the credit side are going to increase the net profit figure. All right. So going back here, we see that our incorrect net profit figure here is 40,000. All right. So this here is incorrect. All right. So what we're going to do now, we're going to start number 1 and we're going to enter in our figures and we're going to add the items on the credit side, TPL items that are on the credit side, and we'll minus TPL items that are on the debit side. So firstly here, we're going to add the €400, but I'm going to write number 1 because that's the error that it came from, and I'm going to write purchases because that is what the item is. Number 2, part 2, we've got purchases on the debit side, so that is going to reduce my net profit figure. So number 2, purchases €10,000. In number 3, I have purchases on the credit side, that is going to increase my net profit figure. So I write number 3, purchases €10,600. Number 4, I have bad debt recovered, 625 on the credit side, that is going to increase my net profit figure. So number 4, bad debt recovered, €625 there. And then lastly, I have number 5, purchases debit side. So that is an expense that's going to reduce my net profit figure. So number 5, purchases €3,000 there. So there are all my TPL items entered there. And then I'm just going to tot it all up. So my 40,000 plus all my items that are going to increase my net profit figure, 51,625. Then I'm going to minus 10,000 and minus 3,000, and that is a corrected net profit figure of 38,625. And as you can see here, this corrected net profit figure will go into the corrected balance sheet in part D. All right, so that is part C done. Now part D, we are going to prepare a corrected balance sheet. So all of the other figures here that we have just highlighted now are the balance sheet entries. So equipment is a balance sheet because it's an asset, creditors balance sheet because it's a liability. So what goes in the balance sheet? Assets and liabilities. Capital is a liability, that's balance sheet. Debtors is an asset, balance sheet. Cash is an asset, balance sheet. Creditor, liability, balance sheet. Bank, asset, balance sheet. Debtor, asset, balance sheet. VAT can be an asset or a liability, it depends on where it is in the balance sheet. Creditor is a liability in the balance sheet and equipment asset in the balance sheet. So just have a look for all your balance sheet items. So by the end of this, you should have all of your figures from your part A highlighted and thrown in somewhere into your question. Okay, so as you can see again, assets and liabilities here, they go in the balance sheet. When an asset increases, we debit. When an asset decreases, we credit. When a liability increases, we credit. And then when a liability decreases, we debit. Okay, so I would write this up on the top of your journalised entries in part A. Above your debit side, I would write asset plus, and then credit side asset minus, and then liability minus over the debit side and liability plus over the credit side. Okay, now what we do first of all is we take our balance sheet and we take all of our figures from our balance sheet and we write them down. Okay, but just slot the original figures here from this is an incorrect balance sheet, so slot them into the side and then we'll do any adjustments then in brackets beside that. So 500,000 premises, motor vehicles, we've got 35,000, we've got equipment 24,000, we've got stock 60,500, we've got debtors 10,800, we've cash 12,200, we've got creditors 52,300, and remember from part B, all right, what happened was we took 6,995 away from our creditors, all right, when we're doing the suspense. So now we're going to add that back in, all right, to get our actual creditors figure. Then we have bank 18,400, we've got VAT 7,500, we've got capital 550, we've got net profit. Now this is as per part C. So net profit €38,625. Okay, that was from part C, our correct net profit. And then we have our drawings 25,700. Okay, now we can have a look at our part A and get started. Okay, so we'll start up at the top. Equipment, debit side, €4,000. So equipment is an asset, so that is going to increase my asset equipment. So plus 4,000 there. Then I have my creditor on the credit side. Creditor is a liability. Liabilities increase on the credit side. So creditors plus 8,000 there. So that's part one done. Part two then, we have capital on the credit side, 10,000. So that is a liability. It's going to increase. So that is 10,000 added to our capital there. Next, we have our debtors. So debtors is an asset. Assets, when they are on the debit side, that is going to increase my asset. So debtors plus 10,000 there. Then we have cash on the credit side. Cash is an asset, and an asset, when it's on the credit side, is going to reduce. So our cash minus €10,000 there. Then part three, we have creditor on the debit side. Creditor is a liability because we usually owe them money, but when a creditor is on the debit side, that is a liability reducing. So my creditor here minus 22,400. So that is part three done. Part four then, we have bank account, all right, debit side 500. Bank is an asset account, all right. However, in this case, the bank is an overdraft. So the bank is a liability in this case, all right. So €500 coming into the bank. Think about it, it's going to reduce your bank overdraft. So your bank overdraft means that you owe the bank money. But when money comes into your account, that's going to reduce your bank overdraft. So 500 is actually going to be minused there. All right. So then we have the next one then is debtor. So debtor is an asset account. So when an asset account is debited, that is going to increase the asset account. So your debtor plus 125. Okay. Then in part five, we have VAT on the debit side, €405. Now, the VAT on the debit side, right? Here, my VAT is a liability, okay? So this, let's treat our VAT as a liability then. Liability, when it's minused, it's going to reduce the liability. Okay, so liability when it's on the debit side, sorry, it's going to reduce the liability. So VAT minus 405 there. Then we have creditor on the credit side of the trial balance there. So creditor, all right, is a liability account. Liabilities accounts on the credit side, we're going to plus. So liability, creditor, plus 405. And then equipment on the credit side, equipment is an asset, so an asset being reduced 3405. So equipment minus 3405 there. So all you have left to do now is tot up all of your final figures there. So nothing happened the premises or the motor vehicles. Your equipment is €24,595. So your total fixed assets there 559,595. Your stock 60,500, your debtors 20,925, your cash 2,200. Your creditors then 45,300, your bank is 17,900, your VAT 7,095. Overall, your creditors 70,295, leaving 13,330 positive there. When we add that to our 559,595, we get 572,925. Your capital there is €560,000. Add that to your net profit, which we got from part C, 38,625, and then nothing happened in your drawing, so that is 25,700 taken away there. And so overall then, that is €572,925. So your balance sheet now balances. That is your corrected balance sheet for part D complete. So that was 20 marks. So part E then is the last part. So outline the purpose of a suspense account. So for 6 marks. So a suspense account is used when there is a mistake in the accounts that prevents the trial balance from balancing. The difference between the debit and credit side of the trial balance is entered in the suspense account. until the errors are discovered in order to allow the trial balance to balance. The relevant errors are corrected through the suspense account and the balance is then eliminated. So that is part E for 6 marks.